The year is 2015. Leonard Fournette was the #1 recruit in the country at one point and had just ran for nearly 2,000 yards and 22 touchdowns. The following year, he is expected to have one of the best seasons a running back can have in college football history. Unfortunately, he would get hurt, but his backup was pretty much just as good, if not better than him. His name was Darius Geiss. He ran for nearly 1,400 yards and 15 touchdowns, while Fournette nearly hit the 1,000-yard mark as well. LSU has produced a ton of good running backs, and there have been some great running back duos in college football, but this one could have been the best ever. Guice and Fournette were both absolute superstars and had extremely high ceilings going into their NFL careers. One of them has sort of panned out, and the other is likely going to be in jail for a long time. In today's video, we're going to talk about this dynamic duo of Darius Geiss and Leonard Fournette, how they got to the points they were at, their terrific LSU careers, and what eventually happened to them. So without further ado, let's get started. Today's story is about two players who grew up in the area, had unlimited potential, and witnessed horrific things as children, but one of them did not let his past define him, and the other let it become his downfall. We're first going to talk about Leonard Fournette. He grew up in the state of Louisiana, and more specifically in an area that was extremely affected by Hurricane Katrina. He apparently had witnessed someone get shot in the head and saw someone steal a watch from a dead body. All of this happened while he was only 10 years old, and I forgot to mention, his grandpa died in the storm, and he also witnessed his cousin get shot as well. Some of that stuff had happened later on in his high school career, but from day one, Fournette was an absolute beast. He was bigger and stronger than every single player, and his coach knew that he was going to be something special. Unfortunately, that coach had seen many players with similar talents to him throw their futures away for drugs and gang violence, and he did not want Leonard to go down the same path. Fournette would start every single game during his St. Augustine high school football career, and obviously became a humongous name on the recruiting trail. Put into consideration how good he was, he went for over 2,500 yards and 30 touchdowns as a true freshman. He continued to be a star, and by the time he was a senior, he had over 100 scholarship offers. He saw football as his way out of the mess he was in, and he was motivated by his past and to be different. He was seen as the next Herschel Walker and was the #1 ranked recruit in the country. But where was he going to go? The three schools that were in the running to land his talents were Alabama, Texas, and the home state school of LSU. Many people thought he would become a Tiger, and that would come true as during the Under Armour All-American game, he would commit to the Tigers. So yeah, at this point, Fournette had the entire world ahead of him, was going to a place that produced a ton of star running backs, and had all the talent in the world to go to the NFL someday. Now let's tell the story of the other member of the duo, Darius Geiss. Geiss grew up in a neighborhood of Baton Rouge referred to as the Bottom, as it had a ton of crime and was very violent. Something terrible would happen to him when he was a boy, as he saw on the news a man was shot in a Denny's parking lot. To his horror, he found out it was his own dad, and from then, he decided to channel all his anger into football. He had told his dad he wanted to play for LSU, and he was now determined to fulfill that promise. He was scared, lonely, and afraid at home, and he did not know if he'd wake up alive the next morning, so the football field became a safe haven for him, and he ran with a style that he called running angry. His mom had a decision to make, as if he went to the local public school, he'd potentially be more distracted and roped into that violence. But because Darius was so good at football, he got an offer to play for a private school known as Catholic High. He didn't exactly fit in right away, and while I have heard conflicting stories, him and his friends apparently experienced a lot of tough times, and he would come home crying at night. Darius apparently hated it and wanted to transfer, but his mom asked him how many kids from his neighborhood would love to have that opportunity, and it fueled Darius to make it work. Darius would get into some trouble in high school, but he became friends with a guidance counselor there who would help him out and sort of take him in. He channeled his past onto the football field and blossomed into a 5-star recruit, and the only back that was ranked higher than him was Damian Harris. After a great senior year, he would go on to the Army All-American game, where he'd have such a good performance, he was named the MVP. Because he could go anywhere in the country, he decided to fulfill his dad's promise, and he committed to LSU. His recruiting ranking would take a little bit of a dip though, as he was ranked a 4-star recruit, the #5 running back, and the 45th best player in the class of 2015. So at this point, both him and Leonard are local kids who went through a ton of terrible stuff as children, but channeled their anger onto the football field and became big-time recruits, with huge futures in Baton Rouge. So as you guys can probably piece together by now, Fournette was actually 1 year ahead of Guice, and he had a lot of hype going into his freshman year. He'd get off to a pretty slow start. He'd have his first big game against New Mexico State, as he would go for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And a crucial win on the road against Florida, he would have a season high at that point, 140 yards and 2 scores, and he'd have another 100 yards and a win over #3 Ole Miss. He couldn't get the job done against Bama, but in the final game of the regular season, he'd go for 146 yards and 1 touchdown in their win over A&M. He would save his best for last, though, as he'd go for 143 yards and 2 touchdowns in a loss to Notre Dame, and he would finish his freshman campaign with 1,034 yards, 10 touchdowns, and was one of the best freshmen in the country. Going into 2015, the LSU running back was going to have Fournette at the forefront, Darius Geiss would be a backup, and Darrell Williams would be the third stringer. Outside of an insane 161-yard game against South Carolina, Guice did not do a whole lot his freshman year. He would finish that 2015 campaign with 436 yards and 3 touchdowns. He'd have 159 yards and 3 touchdowns in his first game against Mississippi State, 228 yards and 3 touchdowns against Auburn, 244 yards and 2 touchdowns against Syracuse, 233 yards and 3 touchdowns against Eastern Michigan, 158 yards and a touchdown against South Carolina, 180 yards and 2 touchdowns against Florida, and 150 yards and a touchdown against Western Kentucky. At this point, he was having an absolutely incredible year, and he was the best running back in America. But as a lot of people find out, Alabama crushes your dreams. He only had 31 yards and a touchdown in that game and was held to 1.6 yards per carry. He would bounce back and would finish with nearly 400 yards in his last 3 games combined, and then in their bowl game, he'd have the best game of his career. Against Texas Tech, he'd go for 212 yards and 4 touchdowns to finish his absolutely incredible 2015 campaign. He would finish with 1,953 yards and 22 touchdowns, and was a first-team All-American, and finished 6th in the Heisman Trophy voting. So going into 2017, many expected Fournette to build upon that, and for Guice to just get a little bit better for the future. Boy, were they all wrong. Going into 2016, Fournette would be given a setback as he would suffer a high ankle sprain right before the season started. He would start against Wisconsin, and he'd go for 138 yards, but they'd lose that game. From there, he would miss the following week against Jacksonville State, and that is when Darius Geiss was unleashed to the world. He went for 155 yards and a touchdown in that game, and showed that he was just as good as Fournette. In Fournette's first game back against Mississippi State, he'd go for 147 yards and 2 touchdowns. The following week, he would re-injure himself against Auburn after 101 yards, and Guice put up 62 yards on 3 carries in that game. Now Fournette was out for a little while, so Guice would take over. In the first game of the Ed Orgeron era, Guice would go for 163 yards and 3 touchdowns against the Missouri Tigers, and then would follow that up with 162 yards and 2 touchdowns against Southern Miss. Fournette would come back on October 22nd, and he would break the school record for rushing yards in a game with 284 yards and 3 touchdowns against Ole Miss. This was an absolute wild stat, and they had 2 superstar running backs, but the funniest stat was still yet to come. Both would struggle against Alabama. Fournette would battle that ankle injury for the remainder of the year pretty much, as outside of a game in which he went for 98 yards and 3 touchdowns against Arkansas, he was pretty much limited. Guice would take that opportunity and run with it, as he went for 252 yards and 2 touchdowns against Arkansas, 83 yards and a touchdown against Florida, and then he would break the LSU school record that was just set by Fournette a few weeks ago, as he would go for 285 yards and 4 touchdowns in a win over Texas A&M. This was just insanity at this point, and Fournette was done for the year, but Guice had one more game in him. He had 138 yards and a touchdown against Louisville, and finished his sophomore year with 1,387 yards and 15 touchdowns. That alone for him to be an All-SEC member and a potential superstar, but add in the fact that Fournette also had 843 yards and 8 touchdowns, and the two combined for over 2,000 yards and nearly 30 scores. This was one of the most incredible backfields in college football history, and it's one of the biggest what-ifs as well, because Fournette was never fully healthy. After this year, Leonard would end up going to the NFL, where he was drafted by the Jaguars, and we will touch on what happened to him in just a few minutes. Now that Fournette was off to the NFL, Guice would have a chance to be the #1 back on the team, and the expectations were through the roof for his 2017 campaign. Unfortunately, just like Leonard the year prior, Guice would miss half the year with a left leg injury. It didn't affect him too much though, as he went for a combined 200 yards and 4 touchdowns in his first 2 games, and against Ole Miss, he'd have 276 yards and a touchdown, which was an SEC record for the most 250-plus yard games. He'd have 147 yards and 3 touchdowns against Arkansas, and would finish the year with a combined 200 yards against Texas A&M and Tennessee. In the final game of his collegiate career, he'd go for 98 yards in a loss to Notre Dame, and would finish his junior season with 1,251 yards and 11 touchdowns. He was still named a second-team All-SEC member despite all the injury, and he was expected to be a big deal in the NFL. In terms of what happened to Leonard Fournette from there, He ran for over 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns as a rookie, dealt with some injuries in his second year, and would have his best career year in 2019 as he ran for over 1,000 yards and 3 scores. He had since gone over to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he ran for nearly 400 yards and 6 touchdowns and helped them win a Super Bowl. Throughout my research, I don't think Leonard Fournette ever got in trouble while he was in college or when he was in the NFL, and despite all the terrible stuff that happened to him as a kid and the horrifying things that he witnessed, he never let his past hurt him. Some call him a bust to a degree in the NFL because of all his hype, but I think he's had a really solid NFL career, has made something of himself, and will be in the NFL for a long time. On the other hand, Darius Geiss was the complete opposite. After being taken in the second round with the 59th overall pick by the Redskins, Guice would be given a tough hand, as not only would his stock fall due to character concerns, and in the first preseason game of his rookie year, he would tear his ACL and miss the entire season. He'd miss most of 2019, but would come back and would have a couple solid games before he would hurt his MCL once again. Through his first 2 years, he barely ever saw the field, and going into 2020, he was on the chopping block, and because of all the stuff that had happened, I think he snapped. In August of this past year, he was charged with strangulation, assault, battery, and destruction of property, and he was arrested because of that. Word also came out that he sexually assaulted 2 women when he was at LSU in 2016, and he also took a picture of a woman in a locker room and spread it amongst the football team. From there, he was immediately cut, his name was stained, and that inspiring story he had was out the window. To make matters even worse, in March of 2021, apparently a 74-year-old woman had accused Guice of sexual harassment, and there's a lot wrong with that to begin with, but man, was he really struggling. Because of that, LSU cut all ties with him, banned him from the athletics program, and removed all of his statistics from his record books. In terms of the actual stats, Guice has been forgotten and is nowhere to be seen in the LSU history books, even though he had one of the greatest running back careers a Tiger back has ever had. Fournette, on the other hand, will go down as one of the best running backs in school history, someone who beat all the odds and had a successful NFL career. It just goes to show you that life is all about what you make of it. If you're given a tough hand as a kid, you either become what you were surrounded by, or you live your life the opposite way. Darius Geiss and Leonard Fournette were one of the best backfield duos in college football history, polarized the entire SEC and college football world, and were so much fun to watch. It's unfortunate to see what has happened to Guice, and I hope he gets his life together. But what do you guys think of today's video? What do you think will happen to Derrius in the future? And give me another topic I could do next. Before you go, be sure to like this video, subscribe, drop a comment, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, and I hope to see you guys again soon. But until next time, peace.